The frigid Wyoming wind bit through Vivian Daniels's thin coat as she huddled against the broken wagon wheel, tears freezing on her cheeks in the November chill of 1876. Her wedding dress, once pristine white, now lay muddied and torn beneath her traveling clothes, a bitter reminder of promises broken. Charles had abandoned her here, left her to die on this desolate stretch between nowhere and nothing after their argument had escalated and the wagon axle had snapped. "I never wanted to marry you anyway," he'd spat before mounting the only horse and disappearing over the horizon hours ago. Night was falling fast, the temperature plummeting with the sun. Vivian's fingers had long since gone numb as she clutched her small carpet bag, all she'd managed to save from the wagon, before Charles had taken everything else of value. 22 years of life, and this was how it would end, frozen to death on the frontier, a mail-order bride abandoned before she'd even reached the altar. The sound came first, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against hard-packed earth. Vivian raised her head, hope and fear warring in her chest. Through the swirling snow, a massive silhouette emerged, a rider, tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy duster that flapped like wings in the wind. The stranger pulled his horse to a stop beside her broken wagon. For a long moment, he just stared down at her from beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His face came into focus as he tilted his head, strong jaw darkened with stubble, eyes the color of a storm cloud, and features hardened by sun and wind and years. "You'll die out here," he said, his voice deep and rough like river stones. Vivian summoned what pride she had left. "I'm aware of that, sir." Without another word, he swung down from his saddle, towering over her as he approached. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, putting him perhaps in his early 30s. He knelt beside her, assessing the broken wagon with a glance, before turning his attention back to her trembling form. "Where's your husband?" he asked, eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't have one," she answered bitterly. "He left me here to die." The stranger's jaw tightened as he looked her over. "What's your name?" Vivian Daniels." "Flynn Xavier," he replied, then stood and held out his gloved hand. "Come on." She hesitated, eyeing his outstretched hand with suspicion. "Where?" "Does it matter?" "Stay here and freeze, or take your chances with me." When she still didn't move, he bent down, gathered her and her small bag in one fluid motion, and carried her to his horse. With surprising gentleness, he settled her in the saddle before mounting behind her, his chest warm and solid against her back. His arms came around her to take the reins, enveloping her in the scent of leather, tobacco, and horse. As he turned his mount toward the darkening horizon, he pulled her more securely against him, his breath warm against her ear. "You're mine now," he said simply, the words both a declaration and a promise. "At least until I can find somewhere safe to leave you." Something in Vivian's frozen heart cracked at those words, not from fear, but from the first spark of hope she'd felt since stepping onto the westbound train 3 weeks ago. Flynn urged his horse forward, and they disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving the broken wagon and Vivian's broken dreams behind in the snow. The moon had risen high by the time the silhouette of a cabin appeared in the distance. Vivian had long since stopped shivering, her body nestled against the warmth of Flynn's chest, his heavy coat wrapped around them both. She had drifted in and out of awareness, the rhythmic motion of the horse beneath them and the steady beat of his heart against her back, lulling her toward unconsciousness. "Stay awake," Flynn commanded, his voice cutting through the fog in her mind. "We're almost there." The cabin stood stark against the night sky, smoke curling from its chimney. As they drew closer, Vivian could make out a small barn set off to the side and a corral where a few horses moved like shadows in the moonlight. Flynn dismounted first, then reached up to lift her down. Her legs buckled beneath her, numb from cold and hours in the saddle. Without a word, he swept her into his arms again and carried her to the cabin door, shouldering it open and bringing her into blessed warmth. The interior was simple but neat, a main room with a roaring fire in the stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with supplies, and a bed tucked into the corner. Flynn carried her directly to the fireplace and set her gently on a bearskin rug before the flames. "Don't move," he ordered, then went back outside, presumably to tend to his horse. Vivian stared into the dancing flames. Feeling sensation painfully returned to her extremities. She took in her surroundings more carefully. Now this was clearly a man's home, with few comforts but everything necessary. A rifle hung above the door, and she noticed a well-worn Bible on the table next to a single tin plate. Flynn returned, stamping snow from his boots before closing the door against the howling wind. He hung his coat and hat on pegs by the entrance, revealing a tall, powerfully built frame, clad in a worn flannel shirt and canvas trousers. His dark hair fell in waves to his collar, and now she could see the full intensity of his gray eyes as he studied her. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, moving to a trunk at the foot of his bed. He returned with a flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks. "These will be too big, but they're warm and dry. I'll turn around." True to his word, he faced the wall while Vivian struggled out of her frozen garments with trembling fingers. The simple act of changing seemed to take forever, but eventually she managed to pull his oversized shirt over her head. It fell to her knees, enveloping her in a scent she was already coming to recognize. "I'm decent," she said softly. Flynn turned, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of her drowning in his clothing. Her damp honey-blonde hair tumbling in waves over her shoulders. Without comment, he went to the small kitchen area and returned with a steaming mug. "Drink this," he instructed, handing her a cup of what turned out to be coffee, liberally laced with whiskey. "It'll warm you from the inside." Vivian took a sip and nearly choked as the liquor burned its way down her throat, but the warmth that followed was worth it, and she took another careful swallow. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes, "for saving my life." Flynn nodded once, then busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. "How did you end up abandoned in a snowstorm?" he finally asked, his back to her as he worked. Vivian stared into her cup. "I was a mail-order bride," she admitted, shame coloring her words. "Charles Holbrook was my intended. We'd exchanged letters for months. He seemed kind in writing. When I arrived in Laramie, he was different, colder. We argued on the journey to his homestead when I discovered certain things he'd lied about." She swallowed hard. "When the wagon broke, he said it was a sign, that he'd made a mistake. He took the horse and left me there." Flynn's movements stilled, his shoulders tensing. When he turned to face her, his expression was dark with anger. "Holbrook, you said? From the Circle H ranch north of here?" She nodded, surprised. "You know him?" "I know of him. He's got a reputation." Flynn returned to his cooking, his movements more forceful now. "Not a good one." "What will happen to me now?" Vivian asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd lifted her onto his horse. Flynn dished the simple meal onto 2 plates and brought one to her. "Tomorrow, when the storm passes, I'll take you to Sweetwater. It's a day's ride. There's a decent boarding house there. You can decide what to do next." "I have very little money," she admitted. "Most of what I had went toward my journey west." He sat in the chair nearest the fire, his plate balanced on his knee. "We'll figure something out. Eat now." They ate in silence, Vivian realizing only as the food hit her stomach how desperately hungry she was. When they finished, Flynn took her plate and set it with his own in a basin of water. "You take the bed," he said, nodding toward the corner. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he cut her off. "You nearly froze to death today. You need proper rest." Too exhausted to argue, Vivian made her way to the narrow bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw but covered with surprisingly clean linens and several warm quilts. As she slipped beneath the covers, she watched Flynn spread a bedroll on the floor near the hearth. "Mr. Xavier," she said softly, "why did you stop? When you saw me by the wagon, most men would have kept riding." Flynn paused in the act of removing his boots. "My mother died of exposure when I was 10, he said, his voice low. "She got caught in a blizzard coming back from town. No one stopped to help her." He met Vivian's eyes across the room. "I don't ride past people in need. Ever." With that, he turned away, settling onto his bedroll and pulling a blanket up to his chest. Within minutes, his breathing deepened, though Vivian suspected he wasn't truly asleep, just giving her the privacy of believing he was. She studied his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows even in repose. This man who had declared "you're mine" when he pulled her from certain death was a stranger, and yet she felt safer with him than she had in weeks. As sleep finally claimed her, Vivian wondered what tomorrow would bring, and why the thought of reaching Sweetwater and parting ways with Flynn Xavier filled her with a curious sense of loss. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the night. Vivian woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up to find Flynn already dressed and moving about the cabin, his bedroll nowhere in sight. "Morning," he said, glancing her way. "Your clothes are dry." "I hung them near the fire last night." Sure enough, her traveling dress and petticoats were folded neatly on a chair by the hearth. Flynn turned his back without being asked, allowing her privacy to dress. The routine felt oddly domestic, as if they'd been sharing this space for years rather than hours. "The snow's not as deep as I feared," he said as she finished buttoning her dress. "We should be able to make Sweetwater by nightfall if we leave soon." Vivian nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. "Thank you again for your kindness." Flynn merely grunted in response, dishing up a breakfast of bacon, biscuits, and coffee. They ate quickly, and soon Vivian found herself once again on Flynn's horse, though this time seated properly on the saddle with her host walking alongside, leading the animal by its reins. "You don't have to walk," she protested. "I'm feeling much stronger today. I could walk while you ride." Flynn shook his head. "Horse is tired from last night. Better to share the burden." His eyes met hers briefly. Besides, a lady shouldn't have to walk when there's a perfectly good horse available. The journey began in companionable silence, the vast Wyoming landscape stretching around them in all directions. The recent snow had transformed the world into a glittering wonderland, the sun reflecting blindingly off white fields broken only by the occasional stand of pine trees or rocky outcropping. As the morning wore on, Vivian found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. Flynn Xavier moved with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in this wilderness. Despite his taciturn nature, there is something compelling about him, a quiet strength that spoke of resilience and determination. "Have you lived in Wyoming long?" she asked, breaking the silence. "All my life," he replied. "My father came west for the fur trade, met my mother, and settled here. Built that cabin with his own hands." "It's a good cabin," Vivian offered. "Sturdy." A ghost of a smile touched Flynn's lips. He'd be pleased to hear that. He was a craftsman at heart. The smile faded. "After we lost my mother, he never really recovered. Died when I was 16. "I'm sorry," Vivian said softly. "You've been alone since then?" Flynn nodded. "Better that way. Less complicated." Vivian thought of her own family back in Pennsylvania. Her father, stern but fair. Her mother, who had wept when Vivian announced her decision to answer Charles's advertisement. Her 3 younger sisters, who had envied her romantic adventure. None of them had understood her desperate need to escape the suffocating future laid out for her. Marriage to the son of her father's business partner, a life confined to polite society and endless social obligations. "What about you?" Flynn asked unexpectedly. "What brought you all the way from—" "Pennsylvania," she supplied, "Philadelphia. And I suppose it was the promise of something different, something real." She laughed softly, the sound hollow even to her own ears. "Foolish, I know." Flynn was quiet for so long that Vivian thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Not foolish to want something different. Foolish to trust a man you've never met, perhaps." "Yes, well." "Lesson learned," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Though I'm not sure what options are left to me now." "You could go back east," Flynn suggested, though something in his tone suggested he didn't think much of that idea. Vivian shook her head firmly. "No, I won't crawl back in defeat. I'll find work in Sweetwater, save money, make my own way somehow." Flynn glanced up at her, something like approval flickering in his eyes. "Sweetwater's growing, but it's still rough. Not many respectable jobs for a woman alone." "I can sew," Vivian said, "and I'm educated. I could teach, perhaps." "Perhaps," Flynn agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. They stopped around midday to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack that Flynn had packed. Seated on a fallen log while the horse grazed nearby, Vivian found herself strangely comfortable in this man's presence despite his reticence. "Do you always rescue damsels in distress, Mr. Xavier?" she asked, a teasing note entering her voice for the first time. Flynn looked up, surprise evident on his face before his expression settled into something wry. "You're the first," he admitted. "Though I've pulled plenty of calves out of mud holes and once rescued a mountain lion cub from a trap." "A mountain lion? Weren't you afraid of the mother?" "Terrified," he said. "But I couldn't leave it there to die slowly." He rubbed his left shoulder absently. "Got the scars to remember it by, too." "You have a kind heart," Vivian observed. Flynn's expression shuddered. "Don't mistake practicality for kindness, Miss Daniels. Out here, you help others because someday you might need help yourself. Is that why you declared I was yours when you put me on your horse?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and Vivian felt heat rise to her cheeks. Flynn's eyes widened slightly. And was that a hint of color on his weather-beaten face? "I didn't mean—" He cleared his throat. "It was just something to say, to reassure you." "I see," Vivian murmured, unexpectedly disappointed by his answer. Well, it worked. I did feel reassured. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Flynn stood abruptly. We should keep moving if we want to reach town before dark. The remainder of the journey passed with fewer conversations, though the silence didn't feel strained. As the afternoon waned, signs of civilization began to appear: fenced fields, scattered homesteads, and finally, in the distance, the collection of buildings that made up Sweetwater. Vivian felt her anxiety growing with each step closer to town. The reality of her situation was becoming clearer. She was alone in a strange place with no connections, little money, and only the vaguest plan for survival. Her fingers twisted nervously in the fabric of her skirt. Flynn must have sensed her unease. Mrs. Littleton runs the boarding house, he said. She's strict but fair. I'll speak to her about giving you a few days' grace on payment until you can find work. You don't have to do that, Vivian protested, though relief flooded through her at his words. I know I don't have to, he replied simply. The main street of Sweetwater bustled with activity even as the sun began to set. Horses and wagons lined the thoroughfare, and the saloon was already doing a brisk business, judging by the piano music and raucous laughter spilling from its doors. Men in various states of trail dust and work clothes moved purposefully along the wooden sidewalks, many pausing to stare at the unusual sight of Flynn Xavier leading a horse bearing a young woman into town. Flynn ignored the curious looks, guiding them directly to a 2-story clapboard building with a sign that read, Littleton Boarding House. He helped Vivian dismount, her legs stiff from the day's journey, then tied his horse to the hitching post. Wait here, he instructed, then climbed the steps to the front door and knocked. Through the window, Vivian could see him speaking with a gray-haired woman, whose stern expression gradually softened as Flynn talked. The woman glanced past him to where Vivian stood, her gaze assessing but not unkind. After a few minutes more, Flynn nodded and returned to Vivian's side. It's arranged, he said. Room and board for a week. Mrs. Littleton says she might know of some sewing work you could take on. Vivian felt tears spring to her eyes at this unexpected kindness. How can I ever repay you? Flynn looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. You don't owe me anything, just... He hesitated. Be careful. Sweetwater's not Philadelphia. I will, she promised. Will I see you again before you leave town? Something flickered in Flynn's eyes, regret perhaps. I have business to attend to. I likely won't be around. Vivian felt an inexplicable sense of loss. This man was a stranger, and yet in the span of less than a day, he had become her only anchor in this unfamiliar world. Then I suppose this is goodbye, Mr. Xavier. Flynn nodded, his expression unreadable. Goodbye, Miss Daniels. He hesitated, then added, I hope you find what you're looking for out here. With that, he untied his horse, swung into the saddle, and with one last nod in her direction, rode back the way they had come, his figure soon swallowed by the gathering dusk. Vivian watched until he disappeared, then squared her shoulders, picked up her carpet bag, and turned to face her new life in Sweetwater, alone once more. Mrs. Littleton's boarding house proved to be clean, if sparse, with strict rules about curfews, male visitors, none allowed, and proper behavior. Vivian was given a small room on the second floor, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. The window overlooked the main street, and that first night she stood watching the activity below until well after most of the lights in town had been extinguished. True to Flynn's word, Mrs. Littleton knew of sewing work the general store owner's wife needed help completing orders for winter clothing, and the saloon had dance hall dresses in constant need of repair. The latter made Mrs. Littleton purse her lips disapprovingly, but as she pointed out practically, "Beggars can't be choosers, Miss Daniels, and those girls pay well for quick work." Within days, Vivian had established a routine. Mornings were spent at the general store, afternoons working on dance hall costumes in her room, and evenings helping Mrs. Littleton with dinner and cleanup. The work was steady but poorly paid, and Vivian calculated it would take months to save enough for her own place or to move on to a larger town with better opportunities. Still, she was grateful. She had a roof over her head, food in her belly, and work for her hands. It was more than she'd had a week ago, freezing beside that broken wagon. Flynn Xavier was never far from her thoughts. Each day she found herself watching the street below her window, hoping for a glimpse of his tall figure and the broad-brimmed hat he wore. Each night she dreamed of gray eyes and the rumbling voice that had declared, "You're mine," in a moment that seemed increasingly dreamlike as days passed. A week turned into 2. And Vivian began to accept that she might never see her rescuer again. She tried to focus on building her new life, making polite conversation with Mrs. Littleton's other boarders, 2 elderly sisters, a widowed schoolteacher, and a young bank clerk who couldn't hide his interest in Vivian, despite Mrs. Littleton's watchful eye. It was the bank clerk, Herbert Winfield, who first mentioned the rumors. "Did you hear about what happened at the Circle H Ranch?" he asked one evening as they sat in the parlor after dinner, the other boarders engaged in a game of whist while Vivian mended a tear in one of her few dresses. She looked up sharply at the mention of Charles Holbrook's ranch. "No." "What happened?" Herbert leaned forward eagerly, clearly pleased to have her attention. "Someone burned down the main house, and that's not all they say. Holbrook himself was found tied to a fence post in his underclothes, half frozen, but very much alive." Vivian's hands stilled on her sewing. "When did this happen?" "Must have been about 10 days ago now. Sheriff rode out with a posse, but they didn't find who did it. Holbrook was raving about some giant of a man who accused him of abandoning a woman to die and said he was extracting frontier justice." Herbert chuckled. "Course, Holbrook's not well liked hereabouts, treats his hands poorly, and cheated more than one man in business deals. Most folks say whoever did it performed a public service, leaving him alive but humbled." Vivian's mind raced. 10 days ago would have been right after Flynn left her at the boarding house. Could he have gone directly to confront Charles? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of something dangerously close to satisfaction. "What happens to Mr. Holbrook now?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Herbert shrugged. "Word is he's heading back east. His ranch foreman's been authorized to sell off the stock and property. Can't say anyone's sorry to see him go." That night, Vivian lay awake long after the household had fallen silent, staring at the ceiling and thinking of Flynn Xavier. Had he risked his freedom, perhaps his life, to avenge her? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. If caught, he could hang for such actions, no matter how justified they might seem to her. And yet, a small, fierce part of her gloried in the knowledge that someone had stood up for her, had ensured Charles faced consequences for his callous disregard of her life. No one had ever fought for Vivian before. 3 more weeks passed, winter settling in earnest across Wyoming territory. Vivian continued her sewing work, setting aside a few precious coins each week toward an uncertain future. She had made tentative friendships with several townswomen, including the sheriff's wife, who occasionally invited her for tea. It was during one such visit that Vivian finally heard news of Flynn. "My Henry mentioned seeing Flynn Xavier in town yesterday," Mrs. Barton commented as she poured tea. "Rare occurrence, that man coming to town when it's not absolutely necessary. Keeps to himself, that one." Vivian nearly dropped her cup. "Flynn Xavier was here, in Sweetwater?" Mrs. Barton nodded, eyeing Vivian curiously. "Do you know him?" "He helped me once," Vivian said carefully. "When I first arrived, I've wanted to thank him properly." "Well, Henry said he was at Henderson's store, buying supplies, might still be in town if the weather holds." Mrs. Barton's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Handsome man, if a bit rough around the edges. Not married either, though plenty have tried to catch his eye over the years." Vivian felt her cheeks warm. "I merely wish to express my gratitude," she said primly, though her heart raced at the thought of seeing Flynn again. The moment tea was finished, Vivian made her excuses and hurried to Henderson's general store, her steps quickening despite the icy boardwalk. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, drawing the attention of Mr. Henderson and the few customers browsing the shelves. Her eyes scanned the store eagerly, but there was no sign of Flynn's tall figure among the shoppers. Disappointment settled heavy in her chest. "Can I help you find something, Miss Daniels?" Mr. Henderson called from behind the counter. Vivian approached, lowering her voice. "I was looking for Mr. Xavier. I heard he might be in town." Henderson nodded. "He was here earlier, stocking up for winter. Said something about heading to the livery to check on his horse before leaving town." He glanced at the clock on the wall. "If you hurry, you might catch him." Vivian thanked him and rushed back out into the cold, her breath clouding before her as she made her way toward the livery stable at the edge of town. Snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes drifting lazily from a pewter sky. She rounded the corner and the livery came into view, and there, just emerging from the wide doors, was Flynn Xavier. He looked much as she remembered, tall and broad-shouldered in his heavy coat, his dark hair visible beneath his hat. He was leading his horse, preparing to mount, when Vivian called out, "Mr. Xavier! Flynn!" He turned at the sound of his name, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable as he recognized her. Vivian hurried closer, suddenly aware of her racing heart and the fact that she had no clear plan beyond seeing him again. "Miss Daniels," he said, his deep voice sending a now familiar warmth through her despite the cold. "You're looking well." "As are you," she replied, suddenly shy. "I heard you were in town. I wanted to see you before you left." Flynn's gaze moved over her face as if memorizing it. "How have you been? Mrs. Littleton treating you fair?" "Very fair," Vivian assured him. "I have steady work sewing, and I've made some acquaintances in town." She hesitated, then added, "I heard about what happened at the Circle H ranch." Flynn's expression hardened. "Did you now? Was it you?" she asked quietly. He looked away, adjusting his horse's bridle unnecessarily. "Man like that doesn't deserve the air he breathes," he said finally, "leaving a woman to die in a snowstorm. There had to be consequences." "You could have been killed," Vivian said, "or imprisoned." Flynn shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time I've taken risks. But he's gone now, and that's what matters." Vivian stepped closer, snow collecting on her bonnet and shoulders. "Why did you do it? You barely know me." Flynn finally met her eyes again, and the intensity there stole her breath. "I know enough," he said simply. They stood in silence as the snow fell around them, neither seeming to notice the cold. Finally, Flynn cleared his throat. I should get going. Storm's coming in, and I've got a long ride. Will I see you again? Vivian asked, unable to hide the hope in her voice. Flynn hesitated, conflict clear on his face. I don't come to town often. Then perhaps I could visit you, she suggested boldly, surprising herself as much as him. To properly thank you for saving my life, I could bring a home-cooked meal. Flynn's eyebrows rose. That's not proper, Miss Daniels. A young woman visiting a man alone at his homestead. People would talk. Let them, Vivian said, lifting her chin. I've already been abandoned by one man and rescued by another. My reputation can hardly suffer more damage. A reluctant smile tugged at Flynn's lips. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. He seemed to wrestle with himself before adding, Sunday, if you're serious, I'll come fetch you after church. Joy bloomed in Vivian's chest. I'll be ready. Flynn nodded, then mounted his horse in one fluid motion. Looking down at her, his expression softened. Stay warm, Vivian Daniels, he said, then turned his horse and rode away into the swirling snow. Vivian watched until he disappeared, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Only as she turned to head back to the boarding house did she realize she was smiling so widely her cheeks hurt. Sunday couldn't come fast enough. Mrs. Littleton was predictably scandalized when Vivian announced her plans to visit Flynn Xavier's homestead. It's simply not done, Miss Daniels. A single woman calling on a bachelor, and Flynn Xavier, of all people, a man who barely speaks to his own shadow. What would your parents say? They would say I'm a grown woman capable of making my own decisions, Vivian replied calmly, though in truth her mother would likely faint at the very idea. Besides, I owe Mr. Xavier a debt of gratitude. He saved my life. Mrs. Littleton's eyebrows nearly disappeared into her hairline. Saved your life? When? How? You never mentioned this. Vivian realized her mistake too late. She'd been careful not to share the full story of her arrival in Wyoming, saying only that her intended marriage hadn't worked out. The less people knew about Charles Holbrook abandoning her, the better. It was when I first arrived, she said carefully. There was an incident on the road. Mr. Xavier happened along and brought me safely to town. I merely wished to thank him properly with a home-cooked meal. Mrs. Littleton studied her suspiciously. And he's coming to collect you after church, you say? Yes, madam. Well, the older woman sniffed. At least the man has the decency to attend services first. But you mark my words, Miss Daniels, you'll be the talk of Sweetwater by Monday morning. Vivian found she didn't particularly care. She spent Saturday baking bread and preparing a stew that could be easily transported and reheated. When Sunday dawned clear and cold, she dressed with particular care in her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and arranged her honey blonde hair in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun. Church services passed in a blur, Vivian barely hearing the sermon as she kept glancing toward the back of the small building where Flynn stood against the wall. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, his dark hair neatly combed, his usual trail clothes replaced with a clean shirt and his least worn pair of trousers. He met her eyes once during the service, the corner of his mouth lifting in the barest hint of a smile, before his expression returned to its usual stoic mask. True to his word, Flynn approached her the moment the final hymn concluded. The curious glances and whispers from the congregation weren't lost on Vivian, but she held her head high as she introduced Flynn to Mrs. Littleton. Madam, Flynn said, tipping his hat respectfully, I'll have Miss Daniels back before sundown. Mrs. Littleton's pinched expression suggested she wasn't entirely appeased, but she nodded stiffly. See that you do, Mr. Xavier. Miss Daniels is under my protection. Flynn's mouth twitched. Understood. The ride to Flynn's homestead was different from their previous journey together. This time, Flynn had brought a wagon with 2 horses, allowing Vivian to sit comfortably on the bench seat beside him. The day was bright and clear, the recent snowfall glittering in the sunlight, and the silence between them felt companionable rather than awkward. You've caused quite a stir in town, Flynn commented as they left Sweetwater behind. Vivian glanced at him. Have I? He nodded. Herbert Winfield at the bank is apparently devastated. Mrs. Barton told my neighbor he'd been working up the courage to court you. Vivian laughed, the sound bright in the winter air. Mr. Winfield is a very nice young man, But? Flynn prompted when she didn't continue. She met his eyes briefly. But he's not the man who pulled me onto his horse in a snowstorm and said I was his. Flynn's cheeks colored slightly, and he looked ahead at the road. About that. It wasn't proper of me to say such a thing to a lady I'd just met. Perhaps not, Vivian agreed. But I've been thinking about it ever since. Flynn's hands tightened on the reins, but he made no reply. They rode in silence for another mile before he cleared his throat. It's not much, he said, nodding ahead where his cabin had come into view. But it's mine. Land's paid for, no debts to anyone. It looks wonderful, Vivian said sincerely. In daylight, she could better appreciate the setting of Flynn's homestead. The cabin sat nestled against a rise of land that protected it from the worst of the winter winds, with the barn and corral positioned to create a natural yard between the structures. A creek ran nearby, currently frozen but clearly visible by the line of trees following its course. Beyond the immediate clearing, pine forest stretched up the mountainside, and to the south, open prairie rolled toward distant mountains. How much land do you have? She asked as Flynn helped her down from the wagon. 640 acres, he replied. Standard homestead claim, good mix of timber and grazing land. Pride was evident in his voice. I've got 30 head of cattle and 5 horses besides the 2 you see here. You've built something wonderful, Vivian said. Your parents would be proud. Something flickered in Flynn's eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't name. He merely nodded and carried her basket of food inside the cabin. The interior looked much as she remembered, though now bathed in daylight streaming through the windows. Flynn had clearly made an effort to tidy up the floor, had been swept, dishes washed and put away, and a bunch of dried wildflowers sat in a tin can on the table. Vivian smiled at the sight. Flowers, Mr. Xavier? Flynn shifted uncomfortably. Found them dried in the barn, thought they might brighten the place up a bit. The simple gesture touched Vivian deeply. This man, who by all accounts rarely welcomed visitors, had gone to considerable effort to make his home presentable for her. She set about warming the stew while Flynn built up the fire. They worked together comfortably, moving around each other in the small space as if they had been doing so for years. When the meal was ready, they sat at the table to eat, the domestic scene so natural it made Vivian's heart ache with longing. This is delicious, Flynn said after his first bite. Haven't had a home-cooked meal like this since your mother, Vivian guessed gently. He nodded. Don't much see the point in cooking proper meals just for myself. Usually make do with whatever's simplest. Everyone deserves a good meal, Vivian said. Even lone cowboys. Flynn's mouth curved in a rare full smile. Is that what I am? A lone cowboy? Among other things, Vivian replied, feeling bold. A rescuer of damsels, a defender of honor, a man of few words but decisive action. Flynn looked down at his plate, clearly unused to such praise. You make me sound like some hero from a dime novel. Perhaps you are, she said softly. To me, at least. His eyes met hers then, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. Vivian, he said, her name like a caress on his lips. What are you doing here? Really? She set down her spoon, gathering her courage. I think you know. I'm not a good match for you, he said, his voice rough. I'm nearly a decade older. I live miles from town. I barely talk most days. You could have your pick of suitors in Sweetwater proper, men with businesses and social standing. I had proper once, Vivian countered. A man with social standing who left me to die when I became inconvenient. She reached across the table, hesitantly placing her hand over his. I don't want proper anymore. I want real. Flynn stared at their hands for a long moment, then slowly turned his palm up to clasp hers. His hand was rough with calluses, warm and strong, around her smaller one. I can't offer you much, he said quietly. Just this cabin, hard work, and a man who would die before he'd let harm come to you. That sounds like everything to me, Vivian whispered. Flynn stood abruptly, still holding her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. They stood facing each other, barely a breath apart, his gray eyes searching hers as if looking for any sign of doubt. I've thought of nothing but you since the day I found you in the snow, he admitted, his voice low. Told myself it was foolish, that you deserved better, that you'd never look twice at a man like me once you had options. And yet here I am, Vivian said, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Here you are, he echoed, his free hand rising to gently touch her cheek. The most beautiful, brave woman I've ever known. Vivian leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. Kiss me, Flynn Xavier, she whispered. I've been waiting since you said I was yours. With a groan that seemed pulled from deep within him, Flynn closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly blazed into something more intense. Vivian's arms wound around his neck as his encircled her waist, pulling her flush against him. She could feel the rapid beat of his heart matching her own, his strong hands splayed across her back as if afraid she might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. I should take you back to town, he said, though his arms tightened around her rather than letting go. Not yet, Vivian pleaded. We still have hours until sundown. Flynn brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression tender in a way she'd never seen before. What would you like to do with those hours? Vivian Daniels? Show me your land, she said. Show me the home you've built. I want to see everything through your eyes. Something like wonder crossed Flynn's face. No one's ever asked to see my land before, he said. Not like that. He kissed her again, briefly but with unmistakable promise, then took her hand and led her outside into the winter sunshine. For the next several hours, Flynn showed Vivian his homestead with the pride of a man who had built something from nothing. They visited the barn where he pointed out his prized stallion, walked along the frozen creek where he'd built a small smokehouse for fish and game, climbed the rise behind the cabin where he showed her the boundary of his property marked by a line of distinctive pines. Throughout it all, Flynn talked more than Vivian had ever heard him speak, describing his plans for spring planting, the new corral he intended to build, The fruit trees he'd started from seedlings 3 years ago that might finally bear next summer. Vivian listened, enraptured not just by the words but by the passion behind them, the vision of a future taking shape in this wild, beautiful place. "You really love it here," she observed as they stood on the rise, looking out over the expanse of his land glittering in the afternoon sun. "I do," Flynn said simply. "It's not always easy, but it's mine. Every rock, every tree, every challenge and reward." He glanced at her. "Does it frighten you? The isolation, the work, the winters?" Vivian considered her answer carefully. "It would be a lie to say it doesn't intimidate me a little. I grew up in a city, surrounded by people and conveniences." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "But I also came west seeking something real, something that mattered. I think I might find that here." Flynn's expression was solemn as he turned to face her fully. "Vivian, I need to be clear about something. If you're considering, if we were to," he took a deep breath. "Life out here is hard, beautiful, but hard. There would be days, weeks even, when we might not see another soul. Winters where we'd be snowed in for months. And I'm not always an easy man. I'm set in my ways after years alone." "Are you trying to talk me out of falling in love with you, Flynn Xavier?" Vivian asked, a smile playing at her lips despite the seriousness of the conversation. Flynn's eyes widened slightly. "Is that what's happening? You're falling in love with me?" "I think I started the moment you pulled me onto your horse and told me I was yours," she admitted. "Is that too forward of me to say?" Flynn shook his head slowly, wonder transforming his features. "No, it's not too forward. He seemed to struggle for words. "It's everything I've been afraid to hope for." The confession hung between them, fragile and precious in the cold air. Flynn's hands came up to frame her face, his eyes intent on hers. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "I want to court you properly, give you time to be certain. Court me. Then," Vivian said, her heart full to bursting, "come to town to see me. Take me to church on Sundays. Let me cook for you and sew patches on your shirts and learn about cattle and horses and whatever else I need to know to build a life here." Flynn's smile was radiant, transforming his usually solemn face. "You make it sound simple." "Perhaps it is," Vivian replied. "Perhaps we're making it complicated when it doesn't need to be." Flynn laughed then, the sound rich and full and joyous. Without warning, he swept Vivian into his arms and spun her around, her skirts flaring in the winter air as she clung to his shoulders. When he set her down, they were both breathless and laughing. "Vivian Daniels," he said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, "would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you with the intention of making you my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. The kiss they shared then was a promise of spring after winter, of love after loneliness, of a future built together on the foundation of that moment in the snow when he had claimed her as his own. The courtship of Vivian Daniels and Flynn Xavier became the talk of Sweetwater. Every Sunday, Flynn would arrive at the boarding house in his wagon, cleaned up and wearing his good clothes, to escort Vivian to church. Afterward, they would sometimes stay in town for dinner at the hotel restaurant, or Flynn would take Vivian back to his homestead for the afternoon, always returning her promptly before sundown, as promised to Mrs. Littleton. Wednesdays became another special day, with Flynn making the journey to town midweek to take Vivian for a walk or to sit with her in the boarding house parlor under Mrs. Littleton's watchful eye. He began bringing her small gifts, a carved wooden hairpin he'd made during the long evenings alone, wildflower seeds he'd collected for her to plant come spring. a soft rabbit fur muff for her hands on cold days. For her part, Vivian continued her sewing work, but now with new purpose. She began setting aside fabric scraps in colors and patterns she thought would look good in Flynn's cabin. She knitted him a new scarf, darned his socks when he sheepishly produced a bagful with holes, and baked bread and pies for their Sunday meals together. As February turned to March and the first hints of spring began to appear, Flynn surprised Vivian by arriving at the boarding house on a Tuesday, his expression serious as he requested a private word with Mrs. Littleton. When the two emerged from their discussion, Mrs. Littleton was smiling broadly, and Flynn looked relieved. "Mr. Xavier has asked my permission, as your temporary guardian, to marry you," Mrs. Littleton announced to a startled Vivian. "I have given my blessing, provided you are in agreement, of course." Vivian's eyes flew to Flynn's face. "Marriage? Now?" Flynn stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "I know it's sooner than we discussed, but I have my reasons." His eyes were earnest as they met hers. "Spring is coming, and with it, the busiest time on the homestead. Calving, planting, repairs after winter, it all happens at once. I'll need to be there full time, which means less time to come to town." He squeezed her hands gently. "I don't want to wait until summer to make you my wife, Vivian. I want you with me at the homestead, building our life together, but only if you're ready." Vivian's heart raced. It had been less than 2 months since their courtship began, though nearly 4 since he'd first pulled her from the snow. Was it too soon? Perhaps by Eastern standards. But out here, where life moved at a different pace, where each day was precious and uncertain, waiting seemed suddenly unnecessary. "Yes," she said, joy bubbling up inside her. "Yes, I'll marry you now." Flynn's face broke into that rare, transformative smile she'd come to treasure. "Really? You're certain?" "More certain than I've ever been about anything," Vivian assured him. "When?" "This Sunday," Flynn said, "after church. I've already spoken to the pastor, and if it's agreeable to you, I thought we might have a small celebration here at the boarding house afterward. Mrs. Littleton has offered to help arrange it." Vivian turned to her landlady in surprise. The older woman was beaming, all her previous disapproval apparently forgotten. "I do love a wedding," Mrs. Littleton said, "and while Mr. Xavier may not be what I initially considered a suitable match, I've come to see his quality. You could do far worse, my dear." Coming from Mrs. Littleton, this was high praise indeed. Vivian impulsively hugged the startled woman, then turned back to Flynn. "Sunday it is." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Word spread quickly through Sweetwater, and Vivian found herself touched by the community's response. The general store owner's wife insisted on helping her alter a dress for the occasion. Mrs. Barton organized a small group of women to prepare food for the celebration. Even the saloon owner sent over several bottles of his best whiskey for toasts. Most surprising was the arrival of a package at the boarding house on Friday afternoon. Inside, Vivian found a beautiful cream-colored shawl of the finest wool, embroidered with delicate wildflowers. The note accompanying it read simply, "For the bride, may you never be cold again. The ladies of the Gilded Rose Saloon." Vivian was moved to tears by the gift from the very women whose costumes she had mended these past months, women who lived on the fringes of respectable society, but who had shown her nothing but kindness. When Sunday arrived, clear and unusually warm for early March, Vivian dressed with trembling hands in her altered gown, a deep blue silk that had once been an evening dress, but now featured a more modest neckline and practical sleeves. She wore the embroidered shawl over her shoulders, her honey blonde hair arranged in soft curls beneath a simple veil that Mrs. Littleton had contributed from her own wedding decades earlier. Flynn waited for her at the front of the small church, looking almost unrecognizable in a new suit acquired for the occasion. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, but it was the expression in his gray eyes as she walked toward him that Vivian would remember for the rest of her life, a look of such profound joy and wonder that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. The ceremony was brief and simple, the small church packed with what seemed to be the entire population of Sweetwater. Vivian and Flynn spoke their vows clearly, exchanging plain gold bands that Flynn had purchased from a traveling jeweler. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor declared. "Mr. Xavier, you may kiss your bride." Flynn's hands were gentle as he lifted Vivian's veil. "Hello, Mrs. Xavier," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "Hello, husband," she replied, her heart so full it felt it might burst. Their kiss was brief but tender. Mindful of their audience, yet unmistakably passionate. When they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the cheers and applause were deafening. The celebration at the boarding house afterward was lively and joyous, with food and drink flowing freely. Flynn stayed close to Vivian's side throughout, his hand rarely leaving hers as they accepted congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like every resident of Sweetwater. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly during a rare moment alone. The two of them standing in a corner of the parlor as the celebration continued around them. Vivian looked up at her husband, and felt a peace she hadn't known since childhood. "Completely," she assured him. "And you?" Flynn's answer was to draw her into another kiss, heedless of the hoots and hollers it provoked from the guests. When they separated, both flushed and laughing, he kept his arms around her waist. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "A wife, a community, a future beyond just survival. And now?" "Now I have everything," Flynn said simply, "because I have you." As the afternoon waned, they bid farewell to their guests and prepared to leave for the homestead, their homestead now. Vivian had packed her few belongings the day before, and these were already loaded in Flynn's wagon. Mrs. Littleton embraced her warmly at the door, tears in the older woman's eyes. "You come visit when you can," she instructed, "and Mr. Xavier, you take good care of our girl." "Yes, madam," Flynn promised solemnly, "every day of my life." The journey to their home was filled with a comfortable silence, both of them processing the momentous change in their lives. As they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, Flynn stopped the wagon. "What is it?" Vivian asked, concerned by his sudden halt. Flynn turned to her, his expression serious. "Before we go further, I want you to know something. That day when I found you by the wagon and said you were mine, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I wasn't claiming ownership." "I know that, Flynn," Vivian assured him. He shook his head. "Let me finish. I wasn't claiming ownership, but in that moment, something in me recognized something in you, like my soul knew yours somehow." He took her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "So maybe I was saying that you're mine in the sense that we belong together. That we were meant to find each other." Tears filled Vivian's eyes at the unexpected poetry from this typically taciturn man. "I felt it too," she whispered. "Even then, half frozen and terrified, something in me trusted you completely." Flynn smiled, then surprised her by climbing down from the wagon and coming around to her side. Before she could ask what he was doing, he lifted her into his arms. "Flynn, what on earth?" "It's tradition," he explained, his eyes twinkling with rare mischief. "A man's supposed to carry his bride over the threshold." Vivian laughed, looping her arms around his neck. "The threshold is still a quarter-mile away." "Then I better get started," Flynn replied, setting off toward the cabin with determined strides, Vivian cradled against his chest. He didn't make it the entire way. They were both laughing too hard by the time they reached the yard, but he did insist on carrying her the final distance, pushing open the door with his foot and bringing her into what was now their home together. Vivian gasped as they entered. During the days she'd been preparing for the wedding in town, Flynn had clearly been busy at the homestead. The cabin was transformed, new curtains hung at the windows, the walls freshly whitewashed, the floor scrubbed clean. A second chair had been added at the table, a small bookshelf constructed against one wall, and most surprisingly, a brand new iron bedstead, with a proper mattress now stood where Flynn's simple bed had been. "Flynn," she breathed, taking it all in as he set her gently on her feet. "When did you do all this?" "Been working on it bit by bit," he admitted. "Wanted it to feel like our home. Not just mine that you were moving into." He gestured to the bookshelf. "Thought you might want to fill that with books someday. And the bed is from Henderson's store, ordered it special last month." Vivian turned in a slow circle, overwhelmed by the evidence of how much thought and care Flynn had put into preparing for her arrival. This man, who everyone in town described as solitary and taciturn, had transformed his bachelor existence into a home meant for sharing. "It's perfect," she said, tears threatening again. "Absolutely perfect." Flynn moved to stand before her, his hands coming to rest lightly on her waist. "There's one more thing," he said. "Something I've been waiting to say properly." Vivian looked up at him questioningly. Flynn took a deep breath, his gray eyes intent on hers. "I love you, Vivian Xavier," he said, her new name rolling off his tongue like a caress. "I have since that day in the snow, though I didn't know to call it love then. I'll love you every day for the rest of my life." Vivian's heart soared at the words she'd been longing to hear. "And I love you, Flynn Xavier," she replied, her hands coming up to frame his beloved face. "With everything I am." As Flynn lowered his head to kiss her, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that she had found what she'd been seeking when she'd left Philadelphia, something real, something true, something that would last through all the seasons to come. And it had begun with a broken wagon, a snowstorm, and a cowboy who had claimed her as his own. 5 years later, the Xavier homestead looked markedly different from the day Flynn had carried his bride across its threshold. The cabin had been expanded, with 2 new rooms added to accommodate their growing family. A proper garden now flourished where once there had been only wild grass, and the corral held twice as many horses as before. The cattle herd had grown to nearly 100 head, making the Xavier Ranch one of the more prosperous in the area. But the greatest changes were inside the cabin, where 4-year-old Frederick played with wooden toys on the rug before the hearth, while his 2-year-old sister, Abigail, napped in the cradle Flynn had crafted with his own hands. Vivian stood at the stove, one hand resting on her again swollen belly as she stirred a pot of stew. At 27, she had grown into her role as a rancher's wife with confidence and grace. Her honey blonde hair was piled in a practical bun, her dress simple but well made, sewn by her own hands, as were most of the curtains, quilts, and children's clothes that filled their home. The sound of hoofbeats announced Flynn's return from checking the north pasture. Frederick abandoned his toys and raced to the window, pressing his face against the glass. "Papa's home," he announced excitedly. "Can I go meet him, Mama? Please." Vivian smiled at her son, the image of his father with the same dark hair and serious gray eyes. "Put your coat on first. It's getting chilly out there." Frederick scrambled to obey, struggling into his coat with determined concentration before racing out the door. Through the window, Vivian watched as Flynn dismounted and caught his son mid-leap, swinging the boy high in the air before settling him on his shoulders. At 38, Flynn Xavier was still as strong and vital as the day she'd met him, though the years of outdoor work had added a few more lines around his eyes and strands of silver at his temples. If anything, Vivian found him more handsome, now his face softened by fatherhood, his rare smiles coming more frequently in the presence of his children. The door opened, admitting a gust of autumn air along with her husband and son. Flynn set Frederick down and crossed to Vivian, dropping a kiss on her lips before placing his hand gently on her rounded stomach. "How are my girls today?" he asked, his deep voice warm with affection. "We're well," Vivian assured him, covering his hand with her own, "though your son seems convinced his new sibling will be a brother." Flynn chuckled, glancing at Frederick, who had returned to his toys. "Is that so?" "I want a brother," Frederick declared without looking up. "Girls are boring." "I'll be sure to tell your sister that when she wakes up," Flynn teased, earning a giggle from his son. Vivian watched the exchange with a full heart. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said. "Why don't you get washed up?" As Flynn moved to the wash basin, Vivian found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. There had been challenges, of course, the harsh winter of '78 when they had been snowed in for nearly 6 weeks, the difficult birth of Abigail that had left Vivian bedridden for a month, the drought last summer that had threatened their cattle. But through it all, Flynn had been her constant, her partner, her love, and she had been his. She'd learned to ride and shoot, to help with calving and branding, to manage the household accounts and barter with traveling merchants. She'd grown stronger, more resilient, more herself with each passing season. Their life wasn't easy. The Wyoming territory demanded much from those who chose to make it home, but it was rich in ways Vivian had never imagined during her sheltered upbringing in Philadelphia. Dinner that evening was a lively affair, with Frederick chattering about the frog he'd found by the creek, and Flynn describing the new foal born to one of their mares. Abigail woke halfway through the meal, grumpy until Flynn scooped her onto his lap, where she contentedly played with his watch chain while stealing bites from his plate. After the children were tucked into bed in their small room, Flynn and Vivian sat together on the porch, wrapped in a quilt against the autumn chill. The stars blazed overhead in a dazzling display impossible to see from any city. "Do you ever regret it?" Flynn asked quietly, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Coming west? Marrying a rough cowboy instead of some city gentleman?" Vivian turned to look at him, surprised by the question after all these years. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." Flynn's eyes searched hers in the moonlight. "Even with all the hardships, the isolation, the work?" "Especially with all of that," Vivian replied, "because it's real, Flynn. Everything we have, we've built together. Every challenge we've faced, we've overcome together." She took his hand, placing it over her heart. "This life, our life, is exactly what I was looking for when I left everything I knew behind." Flynn's expression softened, and he drew her closer. Do you remember what I said that day when I found you by the wagon? Vivian smiled. You said, "You're mine." And were you? Flynn asked. Even then. I think I was yours from the moment I was born, Vivian replied. It just took us a while to find each other. Flynn's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of everything they'd built together. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. I thank God every day for that broken wagon, he murmured, for the twist of fate that put you in my path. As do I, Vivian agreed, though perhaps not in the moment. Flynn chuckled, his hand moving to rest on her rounded belly where their third child grew. What do you think? Is Frederick right? Another boy? Vivian covered his hand with her own. I think it's another girl, she said, and I think we should name her Hope. Hope, Flynn repeated, testing the name. I like it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the stars wheel overhead, the distant howl of a coyote, the only sound disturbing the peaceful night. We should go in, Flynn said eventually. It's getting colder. Vivian nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. At the door, she paused, looking back at the vast Wyoming landscape bathed in moonlight, the land that had nearly taken her life, and then given her everything she'd ever wanted. I love you, Flynn Xavier, she said, the words as true now as they had been on their wedding day. Flynn's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting atop her head. And I love you, Vivian Xavier, more with each passing day. Together they stepped inside, closing the door on the wild beauty of the night and entering the warmth of the home. They had built a testament to the love that had begun in a snowstorm, with a broken wagon, a courageous cowboy, and 6 words that had changed everything. You're mine.